Hi everyone, Professor Kone here, and I'm going to do a lecture about the politics of the American founding. After this lesson, you should have a better understanding of the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation and its shortcomings, the compromises made at the Constitutional Convention, and what we'll start with is a basic kind of understanding and groundwork for understanding history in the United States. I begin this lecture with a quote from Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So, what's that to say is that in these situations, as Desmond Tutu says, right, we have a place to make a stand and to look at situations of injustice and at least at a minimum use our voice, right? If you come at it like, well, a both sides-ism, right, what you are willingly doing is being closed off to situations of injustice, okay? This quote is as timely as it ever was right now, as we're witnessing uprisings across the United States and protests against brutality and injustice against Black people and people of color. So where we are witnessing moments, we're constantly witnessing moments, and I would say for the reasons of all of the political events happening, political, social, cultural events going on in this time period in which we're living, they all have political implications, all of them. Consider, so I have to ask you, have you ever taken a U.S. history class? If you went to school, high school or middle school, a school in this country, surely you've gotten some experience of, usually truncated experience around U.S. history. That is very, usually not in very much depth or detail about the complexity of U.S. history, like in any place. But let me say this as a PSA. So for those of you who did go to school in this country and got some sort of baseline education on U.S. history, and for those of you who did not, if you really want to understand what is happening in the United States, if you want to understand what's happening now, for example, right, a contemporary understanding of what's going on here, you really do need an understanding of history, right? The understanding of politics and history, they come together, right? You really can't do one well without the other, without understanding the historical events that have been taking place. Right. So I ground this discussion even with this map of, we call this map of this country, showing the many different tribes across this country and where their homelands were. Okay. And I do this to ground this is that we have to come at understanding U.S. politics from a baseline understanding that it is based in settler colonialism, right? That there were tribes everywhere, that this wasn't an uninhabited nation when the settlers arrived, okay? And it's important, I think it's important that we always call that into account. What the nation was like, what it's like now, what's going on with the various tribes of our nation. There are many tribes, right? We think of tribes as they're like a nation within a nation. Okay, a nation within a nation. We must take into account the relationship between the United States and the various tribes, the various treaties made historically with the tribes, and the many of those treaties that were broken, many of which majority broken by the United States government. And one case that comes to mind is actually a case that came out of Oklahoma just this summer. I think it made it all the way to the Supreme Court in discussing that most of the state of Oklahoma is tribal land. Okay? And this is just a recent case. I will link to it. I'll link information to it in the description below. But as a baseline, we need to understand that settler colonialism, this whole nation is based on settler colonialism. What are settlers, right? These are people coming from another country, another place, who arrived here, right, to this landmass we think of as the United States of America. They arrived here, they showed up, right, and they stayed, right? They not only did those who showed up stayed, they brought more, more people came. It is a to settle, and most of the ways we discuss settling, right, is about the displacement of local populations and the taking of land. Okay, so you don't get a United States as we know it without this baseline in settler colonialism, where indigenous people were pushed off lands, oftentimes violently experienced extreme levels of violence, disease, misery at the part of the settlers who came. So, in 1609, the first European arrivals began to the country. Well, I don't know if you would think of it as a country at this point, but let's think of it as the landmass that we think of as the United States. The first arrivals are in 1609, and 10 years later in 1619, we've got the first enslaved Africans arriving to Jamestown, Virginia. So let me see. I've got some links here. I will link in the description below to these links, but this right here is a link. It is of, you see the African continent, and you see the Americas, and you see through a visualization of little dots, quickly moving dots, as representation of all the ships that came bringing enslaved Africans to the quote-unquote New World, right? So it's a 2 or 3 minute clip. It's really, tells the story of the slave trade, one aspect of it in the movement of dots across the Atlantic. I highly recommend you check it out. And when we think of, what becomes our nation, we begin with thinking through the original 13 colonies. Okay, so we have here on the right-hand side of this map, highlighting what the original colonies were. Wasn't quite a nation. They're like separate colonies, like separate communities, right? Kind of big for community, but separate spaces, right? Obviously by space, but distinguished colonies, right? Okay, the French Indian War from 1754 to 63. It's not completely, well named, although it has multiple names: the French Indian War, the 7 Years' War. The French Indian War, it doesn't acknowledge that the British were also involved in this war. Okay, and what were these wars for, right? These wars fighting indigenous people. What were they for? Land, resources, land, right? So again, you don't get the French Indian War and this as a baseline without recognizing that the whole American project is based on settler colonialism and the displacement of the indigenous people. Okay. What do I have here? I love using little comics and artistic displays that are also very political. Okay. So what does it say? Nothing was thought of but this taxation, and the easiest method of liquidation, T-A-X. 'Twas enough to vex the souls of the men of Boston town, to read this under the seal of the crown. See tax on tea. They were loyal subjects of George the Third, so they believed, and so they averred. But this bristling and defensive placard set on the walls was worse than a bayonet. Whoa! So what's worse than a bayonet here? Right? Taxes. Right? Taxes. And you know what a bayonet is, right? It's like a gun with a knife on the end. Like it's got a whole stabbing, it's pretty hardcore. Okay? So, we see in 1773 the Tea Act granting a monopoly to the East India Tea Company, and that there was resistance to this taxation on tea, which resulted in the Boston Tea Party, December 12th of 1773. Okay, so what did the Boston Tea Party lead to? right? And what was it? I mean, the Boston Tea Party, it was the destruction of property, right? So the people did not like the taxation without representation. They were not pleased, right? The people in this country, since the founding, have used, look at this example of the Boston Tea Party, right? These as acts of resistance, right? The destruction of property as acts of resistance to injustice. Okay, so when you see the critiques also about what's happening now around property damage, think about the ways in which it's connected to our very conception, right? Our very founding in this country. Okay, I'm going to stop this video there, and I'll start another video next. I'll put the links in the description below.